I go back to my presentation. So I'll tell you something about the large-scale Pacific oyster removal experiment we did in the Oosterschelde in 2006. I did this work together with my colleague Aad Smaal, also from Wageningen University. Over here you can see the Oosterschelde. It's a large enclosed bay, about 350 square kilometers, of which about 100 square kilometers is intertidal area. The whole delta area here is an important nature conservation area because birds that migrate from the north to the south, they stop over in those intertidal areas in the southwestern part of the Netherlands. But next to a nature conservation area, it's also an important area for shellfish culture. We grew mussels and oysters over there, and that leads to sometimes some conflicts between the two functions. So the shellfish culture is mainly a bottom culture. We grow about 25 million kilograms of mussels each year, about 3 million kilograms of Pacific oysters, and also 250,000 kilograms of flat oysters. So those are the traditional oysters. In this graph, you can see where in pink, where the mussels are grown, most in the western part of the Oosterschelde, and here on the eastern part of the Oosterschelde, the oysters are cultured. It's traditional on-bottom culture, so they fish the oysters, but also the mussels with big, large wedges from the seafloor. The traditional oyster culture in the Netherlands is the flat oyster, Ostrea edulis. We do that since 1870, but the species was very susceptible to Bonemia ostrea. And next to that, we had a mass mortality after the severe winter of 1962-1963, where a lot of those flat oysters were frozen and killed. From that time, they introduced the Pacific oysters in 1964, actually to help the oyster culture with new recruits. At that time, it was also planned that the Oosterschelde would become a freshwater lake to prevent the land from floodings from the North Sea. And it was expected that the Oosterschelde was too cold for reproduction of the Pacific oysters. It turns out to be not the case. And in 1971, the first wild Pacific oysters were found in the Oosterschelde. And since then, there was actually an exponential increase of the total area of Pacific oysters, wild Pacific oysters in the Oosterschelde. In this map, we see the distribution of Pacific oysters in 1980. Only 15 hectares of Pacific oysters. You can see it here, mainly in the northern part of the Oosterschelde. They were attached to some hard substrates over there. In 2012, we see more wild oyster beds of Pacific oysters. This area is about 50 kilometers. So in 1990, we had already more than 200 hectares of Pacific oysters. In 2005, we had more than 700 hectares of Pacific oysters in the Oosterschelde. Yeah, this led to a lot of problems for other functions. The wild Pacific oysters, but also other wild shellfish species like the cockles, they competed for the food with the cultured mussels and also the cultured oysters. On the other hand, the wild oyster reefs are not a good food source for birds. They have a lot of difficulties to prey on the oysters. And there was also growth on sluices and dikes, and that led to a lot of extra work to maintain the sluices. But also for the recreation, it leads to problem. We see here a sign from that time. It says, take care of the oyster shells with sharp edges. They can cause deep cuttings. So yeah, people were actually injured by the oysters. With respect to carrying capacity and impact on the mussel sector, we see here the total grazing pressure of all the shellfish species in the Oosterschelde over time. In orange here, it's the grazing pressure by the mussels. That's a huge amount. The grazing pressure is also due to the wild Pacific oysters, which leads to the problem for the mussel farmers. So, initiated by the mussel farmers, there was a large-scale removement project for the wild oysters organized in 2006, where about 4 experimental plots, each 12.5 hectares, so in total 50 hectares of wild oyster beds were removed. So there was one here, an intertidal bed in the Zandkreek, a large intertidal bed here in the Vondelingsplaat, and 2 actually subtidal beds in the eastern part of the Oosterschelde. From there, the oysters were collected by large dredges, and the shells and the oysters were dumped at 2 dumping locations. One Oudijkse Gat and the other one here at the Middelplaat. And the idea is to dump them over there, and that they will be that the oysters will suffocate and that they will die in the deep gullies of the Oosterschelde. Here we see the detail of the location Zandkreek. So this is in yellow the oyster bed, and in red is what was fished from there. And here in this aerial photograph we can see the oysters, almost 15 hectares of wild oysters laying on that location. This was the other location, location Vondelingsplaat. Here the map, and here the aerial photograph of this large oyster beds on the Vondelingsplaat, in tidal beds. So the fishery was done by the mussel farmers with big boats and large nets. Those heavy nets were also put extra weight in that, so they buried deep into the bottom. And all the oysters were collected in the ship and dumped at that dumping locations. Over here we can see the total efforts of the fishing experiment over time. In total, it costs about 1,000 boat hours to remove the oysters, and that equivalent of that is that it's about 20 boat hours per hectare was needed. The total cost of this experiment was about 300,000 euros to remove those 50 hectares of oysters. Actually, we did not have to pay for that. The mussel farmers did that voluntarily because they wanted to get rid of the oysters, but we calculated what it would have cost if we have to pay them. And over here you can see the catch per unit of effort, actually the total catch per hour, and we see that in the beginning it was easy to collect the oysters, but in the end it was very difficult to. It took a while to get some of the oysters in the nets. So next to the experiment itself was also a large monitoring project to measure the amount of oysters before and after at the plots. We used a large grab for that, 1 by 1 meter grab. We looked at the sediment composition at the sites, if it changed due to to the fishery. We looked at the benthic fauna. We looked at birds and also the morphology of the location. If there was extra erosion and also sedimentation at that location. In total, more than 12,000 tons of oyster reef was removed during this experiment. This is about a total volume of 22,000 cubic meters, and that's equivalent to about 650 large sea containers. So this 12,000 tons, there was a total oyster reef that was removed. And in those oyster reefs, we estimated that about 3,600 tons of living oysters were removed, which is about 3% only of the total stock in the Oosterschelde. Here are two pictures of the sites at Zandkreek. In left before you see the oyster reef, and on the right after fishing. So a lot of those oysters were removed, but still some remains were present over there. This is the same location, but then from aerial plots. This picture we saw already with the oyster reef before, and here we can see the location where the oysters were removed. The other location, the Vondelingsplaats, which is a different location, more exposed location, and also the Vondelingsplaats is more sandy location than the Zandkreek. So this is the reef before it was fished, and over here we see the reef after it was fished. So we see again some sand over here, but also a lot of shell remains on the location that was fished. Over here we see some details at the Vondelingsplaats. So here we see the reef which is not fished, and over here what was fished. Here we see a lot of dead shells lying there. Also on this picture, this is the reef which is not fished. Over here part which is fished. A lot of shell remains still present at the location. When you look at wading birds, they also use the oyster beds to forage in between. In this, and not all the wading birds do it in the same way. For example, oyster catcher, they use the oyster bed to forage, but also outside the oyster bed. So those white bars are outside the oyster beds at the reference location, and the grey bars is the location which is fished. So we see a decrease in the use of oyster catchers before and after fishing. And when you look at another species, for example the Dunlin, it doesn't use the oyster bed to forage, but it likes bare intertidal area, just sand and mud to forage. Yeah, well, as I said, after fishing, a lot of shell remains were present at, especially at the Vondelingsplaats. So we see here dead shells, which are inside the intertidal flats. But also in that year, 2007, we had a very high recruitment of new spats, especially on those shells. You can see over here, you can see all the small spats of new oysters attached to the shell remains on the oysters. Then you can see here a lot of spat in that year. And actually, due to the good spat fall just after fishing, the oyster bed recovered after 5 to 8 years later. After the experiments, also oyster farmers, they were allowed to fish, especially in the subtidal locations for oysters and for oyster spats. They did that from 2006 on. You can see here how affected that was. It was the eastern part of the Oosterschelde, where we see the oyster beds over there. And in 2019, it's actually disappeared, all the oyster beds over there. And especially because the oyster farmers repeatedly go there to fish for either the shell remains, because they use also the shell remains to collect new spats, or they fish on there for the spats for the culture plots. So it's more repeated fishing. Yeah, next to the impact of the Pacific oysters, the wild Pacific oyster beds, so, when you look at carrying capacity, also effect on recreation, there are also some goods and services by Pacific oysters. And a very interesting book is by my colleague Aad Smaal, The Goods and Services of Marine Bivalves, is that also oyster reefs provide habitat for different hard substrate organisms. They can provide habitat to fish species, but also birds. By filtering the water, they can also reduce turbidity in an area, and they can even increase sedimentation because they collect suspended solids from the water column, and they drop it at the intertidal flats in the form of phases and pseudophases. So they can actually increase sedimentation with that. Oyster reefs can also protect the hinterlands by decreasing the wave effect on that, which is illustrated in this plot. Also, like other shellfish species, Pacific oysters can have a role in the Newton cycling in the system, and with that increase primary production, and also other goods and services can be thought of. So it's also always good to think about negative effects, but also think about positive effects of oyster reefs, especially if you cannot get rid of it. So to conclude my presentation, dense oyster reefs could be removed using mussel dredges, and we proved that. But it's important to remove all shell remains because every substrate that is left on the location can be used as substrates for new spat fall. We also dumped the oysters at dumping locations with the idea that the oysters will die from suffocation. But that also didn't work. And that was mainly due to logistic reasons. The mussel farmers who fished for the mussels, they dumped it at the oysters at the dumping locations, and they wanted to do it quick. After that, they could go home. But that's not a good method. It's better to grind the oysters before they are dumped at the locations. So we are sure that they will die. They are dead. Another way, because if it's not possible to remove all the shell remains, the fishery should be repeated every couple of years to prevent recolonization. And I think the experiment after that with the oyster farmers proved that that could work. And finally, the oyster reefs could have impacts, but also you should think about the ecosystem services they could give. Yeah, that was my presentation. I hope it was clear for all of you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Merci à la traductrice.
Sur une traduction très technique comme ça, comment on dit naissin en anglais? Spat. Spat. Merci beaucoup. Des questions dans la salle? Ici, c'est Jean-Pierre Guéret.
Oui, bonjour. Yes, good afternoon. There are locations where we have a regrowth in terms of oysters. So what can we do? Because you didn't go below to sediment surface. So what do you do to remove shells that are underneath the surface? Do you think that if you scrubbed more in depth, you would have less colonization? Or if you had to redo it all over again, would you use the same technique? Or would you use another technique?
Can somebody translate this? Can somebody translate the question, please?
Je peux reformuler, si vous voulez. Est-ce qu'il faut que je reformule en fait? Voilà, c'était ma question.
So can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, okay.
Vous avez besoin qu'on reformule la question?
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Oui. Du coup, d'un point de vue technique,
So at the technical level,
contrairement à ce qu'on a pu faire nous
on the
en baie
contrary
de
to
l'Aiguillon,
what we did here in the Aiguillon Bay,
vous n'avez pas creusé en dessous de la surface du sédiment.
Deeper
Sorry,
under
can
the
you-
sediment surface.
Yeah, I heard
Can
your
you
voices.
hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but I hear French and English
Ah.
simultaneously.
Contrary to what we did in Aiguillon Bay, you didn't go far under the sediment. If you were to redo the experiment, what would you do differently?
Yeah, I think we got into the sediment as far as we could go with the dredges, but we also dug out an oyster bed by hand. And you would have to go a half meter, maybe 1 meter into the sediments to find no shells anymore. So it's very difficult to go deeper than 10 or 20 centimeters into the sediments. But what is very important, I think, to repeat the fishing at this type of scale. So when there's new spadfall, you should collect it again and either use it or dump it somewhere else to have an effective removal of the oysters.
Question? Une autre question? Another question, please.
Another question?
Thank you again.
Une autre
Yeah, I'm sorry for the problems.
Une autre question des internautes qui demandent.
So we have another question online. What is the environmental impact of these withdrawals, these removals?
What are the environmental impacts of these kind of works?
Yeah. Temporarily, you have some effect of the what we saw, the birds that did not like to go on the fished oyster beds. Before they like to go there to forage in between that, and afterwards it took a while to come back because they wait till the oyster bed is restored, and then they use it as they did before. So there was some impact on birds. But also after a couple of years, this impact was diminished. Another important thing is that the oyster beds in the Oosterschelde, we have also a problem with erosion of the intertidal flats due to the on one hand the construction of the storm surge barrier in the Oosterschelde, and the other hand the sea level rise. So the intertidal beds are eroding and sinking into the water. And what the oyster reefs also do, which is also good in service of those oyster reefs, is that they protect also the intertidal bed of the intertidal bed for erosion. So by removing the oyster bed, also this protection, erosion protection diminished. We looked at that also. We looked at sedimentation erosion, but also because some of the shell remains also stayed into the bottom of the intertidal flats, the erosion took not place over there. But it was also a potential impact also to the system. With that also to the birds who use this area, these intertidal areas for foraging.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm sorry.
Donc, j'appelle maintenant Christophe Holler.
Now calling Christophe Holler to the floor, who is the Deputy Manager of the Maritime